Okay, my name is Josh Ryan. My talk today is called Constituting the Vigor of Executive Authority, Veto Override Thresholds and Policy Outcomes. This is a talk about executive power. Executive power has been a neglected area of American politics for a long time. There's renewed interest in it now, however. The new research is focusing on executives in a different way than that has previously been done in political science. Previously, executives were focused on individually in terms of historical context or their personalities. New research now is trying to treat executives and executive concepts like executive power as things that we should be making generalizable theories and statements about, things that we can measure empirically. And I think this research fits nicely into this emerging literature. This is a project, by the way, with two other assistant professors, Rob McGrath at George Mason and John Rogowski at WashU, and I'm going to present one part of this project today. I'd like to start by talking about institutional design in presidential systems. The key components, the two key components of how presidential systems are set up is that first, they have a separated lawmaking powers. That is, the legislature is in charge of making the laws, the executive is in charge of enforcing the laws, and these powers are separated. The second is that the legislature and the executive are subject to each other's checks and balances. This is famously articulated by Madison in Federalist 51. And checks and balances allow each branch to exercise a negative power over the other, that is, prevent the other branch from doing something. Contrast both separation and powers with checks and balances in presidential systems to, say, a parliamentary system where the executive is typically a member of the legislature. There is no separation between the two branches, and there is no ability for the executive or the legislature to check each other. The reason the framers did this, as they talk about in, again, Federalist 10 and Federalist 51, is that they were fearful. They were fearful of majoritarian legislatures. They believed that legislatures tended to become tyrannical over time. They tended to descend into populism and chaos and persecute minorities. On the other hand, they were also fearful of executives. They didn't want to give too much power to one person. By having an executive, you risk that person turning into a demagogue or becoming dictatorial. So by creating a system of separated powers and checks and balances, the framers hoped, they thought that this would keep both of them in their place, so to speak. And again, that's what Madison talks about in Federalist 51. Perhaps the most important formal power that the president has is the veto. The Constitution grants the president his main check on the legislature is the ability to veto legislation. That is, the ability to stop a bill from becoming law. As I mentioned, the title of the talk is Constituting the Vigor of Executive Authority. This is a line from Federalist 73 when Hamilton specifically discusses veto powers. And the idea of the veto is that this is the president's provision, his check on the legislature. This is the way in which he can prevent the legislature from enacting improper laws. The president, in this view, is seen as a defender or a protector of the public. The veto is the president's shield. It's the thing that allows him to block action by the legislature. These are all lines from the Federalist Papers. And the veto is the institutional rule that allows the president to protect his sphere of influence, his powers. However, the veto is not an absolute power. It is qualified. In fact, the legislature has their own check on the president's check in the federal system. That is, the veto can be overridden by a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. Now, although we require a 2/3 veto override at the federal level, there's nothing magical about this. In fact, the framers debated whether a 2/3 override was appropriate. Again, Hamilton in Federalist 77 talks about perhaps an absolute negative, an absolute veto in the legislature. But he rejects this idea. He says, well, this would be neither safe nor sufficient, and it might be abused. And in fact, the framers had a lot of experience with absolute vetoes. In fact, Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, the very first thing he lists as his complaint is that the king has refused his assent to laws. In other words, the king has exercised an absolute veto over legislative actions passed by colonial legislatures. And of course, the framers not only had experience with the king, they had experience with colonial governors at this time who represented the crown, who exercised vetoes of varying strength. And this made them suspicious of allowing the president to have an absolute veto, or a veto that was too easily enacted, and veto that it was too difficult for the legislature to overcome. So again, there's this inherent tension in presidential systems, and there's an inherent tension in American political thought between the power of the president with respect to his power to check other branches, the legislature most specifically through the veto, and the legislative power to check the president's veto, to override that veto. The idea of checks and balances and this tension has implications for other presidential systems as well. And I should point out for the states, all the states have a presidential system, a separated power system, just like the federal government. Most of Latin America has a presidential system. And in fact, there's quite a bit of variation in veto override requirements in other countries. So for example, as I have there, Argentina, Chile, and Mexico have 2/3 override requirements. There's a 3/5, a lower veto override threshold. In Uruguay, 3/5 is 60%. And countries like Brazil, Colombia, and Peru, they have only a 1/2 + 1 veto override. The question is then, how do vetoes and the veto override requirement, how do these institutional rules shape legislative outcomes? And fundamentally, how do these rules promote power among the executive or take power from the executive and give it to the legislature? That is, how does the veto and veto override requirements contribute to that tension between executive legislative relations? And that's the fundamental question I'm going to ask today. I'm going to show some evidence that the veto override is in fact a very important tool, and it's a very important tool for understanding executive power. What I'm going to do is I'm going to offer a theoretical framework to understanding these, despite the fact that the framers were worried about the veto, and they sought to make the veto override something viable, something that could be used by the legislature. We actually don't have much evidence to suggest that the veto and the veto override are important. That is, the veto override offers the legislature a viable alternative, a viable way to check the executive. In fact, we don't really have a theory to explain how these two institutional rules, the veto and the veto and override requirements, contribute to executive legislative relations. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to offer a theory and empirical evidence that suggests they do. The theory is going to draw on two components. The first is a lawmaking component. This is sometimes called the pivotal politics model, most famously articulated by Crable. And the pivotal politics model simply says that in a separated system, a few key actors must be satisfied for any policy to be enacted, that is, for a bill to become a law. Depending on the rules of the chamber and of the system, these pivotal actors, these key actors, are usually the chamber median, an executive, or some other pivotal actor, in this case, the veto override pivot, the person whose vote is necessary to override a veto. I'm going to draw on this lawmaking theory. I'm also going to draw on a second theory, a theory of executive legislative bargaining. This theory suggests that because there's common knowledge about the institutional rules, because the legislature knows the executive has a veto, and because the executive understands that the legislature can override that veto, the two branches engage in bargaining, and that bargaining is structured by the institutional rules, despite the fact that we may not actually even see a veto or a veto override requirement. In other words, the veto and the veto override requirement are important. They structure bargaining between the two branches, even if we don't observe a veto, or even if we don't observe a veto override. What I'd like to do then is I'm going to test these theories of vetoes and override requirements. Unfortunately, these cannot be tested at the US federal level, and the reason is simply there's no variation. The Constitution specifies a 2/3 override requirement for both the House and the Senate, and that has been true through our entire history. This is a question, as I mentioned, that's also important to comparative scholars. Again, this is very difficult to test at the comparative level. In many countries, there are other different institutional rules which make it difficult to draw out inferences on the veto override requirement. There are different cultural contexts, and these two things kind of combine to make it difficult to understand how veto override requirements across different countries affect policy outcomes in those countries. There might just be too many other things going on. I'm going to actually use the states to test these theories. And there's a couple good reasons. First, the states offer some interesting variation in veto override requirements. They use similar lawmaking rules, similar passage rules. They have similar culture, more or less. So we can hold a lot of other things constant while we test the effects of override rules and veto rules in these different states. To give you, to demonstrate how much variation there is at the state level, the states in green, like the US federal government, all have 2/3 override requirements. The states in blue, however, and there are 7 of those states actually offer a lower override requirement, a 3/5 override requirement. It's a little bit hard to see, but Rhode Island, Delaware, and Maryland are 3 of the states. And notice these are not just the small states or the lightly populated states. Illinois, Ohio, North Carolina all have 3/5 override requirements. Interestingly, the states in yellow actually only require a 1/2+1 veto override, legislative size to override a veto, I should say. And again, there's quite a bit of variation, and these are relatively large, relatively populous states like Indiana, Tennessee, Kentucky. So there is significant variation at the state level, and I can use this variation to leverage some inferences about override requirements. This is a debate that has implications for right now, for today. For example, North Carolina didn't even adopt a veto until 1997. It adopted a 3/5 veto in 1997. Prior to that, North Carolina was the last state without a veto. There is, Alabama just completed a constitutional convention. The committee made recommendations on how they should change the Constitution. One of the things that the current Alabama governor, Robert Bentley, has been pushing for is he's been pushing for Alabama to increase its veto override from 1/2 to 3/5. And the governor says that the veto at this time in Alabama, it doesn't have much meaning. It doesn't have, it affects his ability to bargain with the legislature. In Illinois, there is currently an Illinois governor's race going on. Bruce Rauner is the candidate, the Republican candidate. He actually has a chance of winning. The incumbent Democratic governor, Pat Quinn, is not particularly popular. One of the things that Bruce Rauner's been pushing is he's been pushing voters in the state of Illinois to raise the veto override requirement by ballot proposition from 3/5 to 2/3. Bruce Rauner says correctly that this would bring Illinois in line with most states, but he also makes this claim. He says the governor is the only statewide elected official involved in the lawmaking process. So by raising it to 3/5, this is going to help ensure the best interests of all Illinoisans are represented. Bruce Rauner might be the first gubernatorial candidate to try to increase his powers before he's even elected. Unfortunately for him, the state Supreme Court just threw this off the ballot. But if Bruce Rauner wins, he said he's going to pursue this. He said this is an important part of reforming state government. So it's important, it's critical that we understand how override requirements structure executive legislative bargaining. Does raising the override requirement actually produce stronger governors, stronger executives? Okay, so the way I'm going to develop the theory is I'm going to use a formal model, but I first want to talk about the theoretical expectations with higher override requirements before I introduce the model and I talk about the model-specific predictions. The theoretical expectation that I'm going to develop is that higher override requirements promote larger coalition sizes. And what I mean by a coalition size is I mean the number of legislators who vote for the passage of a bill within a chamber. And the connection between override requirements and coalition sizes is something I'm going to demonstrate in a second. But simply put, if the veto override requirement is larger, more people should be voting yes on a bill when it comes up for final passage. However, as I'm going to demonstrate, this is conditional on the preferences of the executive relative to the legislature. In other words, the veto override requirement will not be important. It will not have a significant effect on coalition sizes when the executive and when the legislature have similar ideological preferences. The reason I'm using legislative coalition sizes is because I can't actually measure policy outcomes directly. There's no way to measure how much the governor asks for and then how much he gets, or the type of bill that's passed based on the override requirement. But coalition size implies something about policy. It implies how close it was to the governor, the new policy, and it also implies the extremity or moderation of the policy. That is the new policy relatively close to the old status quo, or is it an extreme new policy? That is it far away from the old status quo? I want to preview some of the results right now. There's two things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about coalition sizes a little bit later on in the talk. I'm also going to talk about how much power governors have in actually proposing legislation, specifically budgets. And what I'm going to demonstrate is that higher override requirements produce larger coalitions, and they give the governor more power when it comes to budgetary negotiations. That is, governors get more of what they want in budgets. Okay, so let's begin to develop a theoretical model of how veto overrides structure legislative outcomes. So the first thing I need to assume is that the legislature is going to want to move policy away from the executive. That is, they're going to want to pull policy in a direction the executive doesn't want it to go. If the executive, in the example I'm going to use, the executive is pretty conservative, and the legislature is going to want to make policy more liberal. And by the way, it doesn't matter which direction we go. The inferences are exactly the same. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to use a one-dimensional spatial model. I'm going to assume that the veto override legislator is pivotal, and that they vote for the policy closest to their ideal point. This needs to be the case, one, so that a veto could occur, and two, so that the veto override actually comes into play rather than just the executive. And again, I'll demonstrate this formally in just a second. But the important point here is that the executive must be far away from the chamber median, the other pivotal actor, the person that must prefer new policy. So the way this is going to work is the legislature is going to propose some policy. The governor has the opportunity to veto that policy, and the legislature has the opportunity to override. And this is just structuring the formal setup so that we understand that the formal setup is going to mimic what happened far away from the chamber median. That is, it must be exterior to the veto override pivot, farther away from the chamber median than the veto override pivot is. Okay, so let's first look at a situation when the chamber median, a situation when to override a potential veto, the only thing that's needed is a majority of legislators, 50% plus one. I've got my one-dimensional policy space here. The executive lies far to the right. The executive prefers a more conservative policy. The chamber median prefers something in the middle. That's C sub M. Notice at the same time that C sub M and V sub O, that is the veto override pivot, are the same person. That is, the person who has to vote for the bill originally and the person who gets to override the veto, who has to be included in a coalition to override the veto, they are the same person. Why? Because that's what the rule specifies in this state. It's 50% plus one. Okay, so policy is going to move from the executive. The chamber median is going to want to pull policy from the right to the left toward the chamber median. The executive is not going to want that because that's moving policy farther away from the executive. They will veto, and in this case, the chamber median and the veto override pivot are the same person. Once the executive vetoes, the chamber median can override that veto simply by having another vote. In this case, the policy can end up exactly at the chamber median's ideal point, but here's the important thing, and this is how we're going to get empirical leverage. The minimum winning coalition, that is the fewest number of legislators who could possibly vote for this veto override, is indicated by space alpha, that is the chamber median and everybody to the left. And the reason that's the case is because the chamber median and the veto override must vote for the new policy. If they don't, the policy will not win. The veto will be sustained. So they must vote for the new policy. That is, and everybody to the left, at a minimum, must also vote for that new policy, or will vote for that new policy. Now, it's possible some people to the right, depending on where the new policy ends up and where the status quo is, will vote for that policy. But the smallest possible winning coalition is the chamber median and everybody to the left. In other words, to put it more simply, the smallest possible size of a coalition that can override a veto in this case is 50% plus one, 1/2 plus one. All those people must vote for the new policy for the veto to be overridden. Okay, let's now look at when the veto override is 3/5. Now I've labeled the veto override person, that pivot V sub O. They are no longer the chamber median. In fact, they are farther away from the chamber median. And the minimum winning coalition now must include the chamber median, of course, the veto override pivot, and everybody to the left of the veto override pivot. Again, we're moving policy from the right to the left toward the veto override pivot. Once it gets to the veto override pivot, it may stop. The veto override pivot will vote for that new bill, and as will everybody else to the left, because they're going to prefer that new policy to the old status quo. That is the minimum winning coalition under a 3/5 rule. You'll also notice I've labeled space gamma. That is the gridlock interval. The gridlock interval is the space in which policy cannot move to the left or the right. The reason is if policy within that gridlock interval moves to the left, both the veto override pivot and the executive will not prefer that, so they will vote against it, which means it won't pass. If policy in that interval moves to the right, the chamber median will not prefer it, so they will not vote for it. But the important point here is that we've now got two formal predictions about how veto override rules structure policy outcomes. In the first case, a majority is the minimum winning coalition size, that is the minimum number of legislators needed to pass a bill. Now it's actually 3/5. You need at least 3/5 of members to vote for the bill. And of course, when the veto override pivot is 2/3, the same thing happens, except now the veto override pivot is much farther away. The gridlock interval labeled gamma has expanded. The minimum winning coalition, the fewest number of legislators that you need, is now indicated by alpha, and that includes at least 2/3 of members. Again, it's possible coalition sizes could be larger, but at a minimum, they need to be this large to pass a bill. Now, the thing that the spatial model tells us is that it demonstrates formally why the executive needs to be far away, why they have to have divergent preferences from the chamber median. If they are in that space between the veto override and the chamber median, then the veto, while their predictions become unclear because the veto override pivots, I should say the executive may not need to veto. That is, policy will simply move into a gridlock interval and will stop, and there won't need to be a veto. So for the veto to actually be meaningful, we need the executive to be far away, and that's going to be a key empirical prediction. Okay. To put this more simply, to put this another way, if the executive is far away from the chamber median, that is, there is a large distance between the two, the veto override pivot, the 1/2, 3/5, or 2/3 person becomes pivotal. A coalition must be at least that big. Okay, so how am I going to test this? The first thing I'm going to do is I'm simply going to do a cross-sectional analysis of veto override thresholds in the states. And I'm going to look at how coalition sizes change within each state based on their override requirement. The second way is I'm actually going to leverage the introduction of the veto in North Carolina in 1997 and compare coalition sizes in North Carolina between 1996 and 1997. The key independent variable here is the existence or the override threshold, I should say. That is it 1/2 plus 1? Is it 3/5 or is it 2/3? I also need to have a measure of the distance between the executive and the chamber median. Now, unfortunately, there's not a good way of doing this at the state level. We do not have exact measures of gubernatorial preferences or chamber preferences, especially on individual bills. I'm going to use a proxy, and that proxy is divided government. And that seems to make sense because in divided government, we're going to have an executive who's very different than the legislative chamber. Okay, the dependent variable here is the size of the winning coalition. That is the number of lawmakers who vote for a bill on final passage. I need to do one other thing, which is I'm going to vary the cutoff sizes of bills that I look at. That is, I'm going to take subsamples out of the bills, out of all bills, and I'm going to examine how the override threshold affects these subsamples. So for example, we could just look at all bills, every bill that was final passage that was voted on. This includes a lot of bills. The problem is this also includes a lot of bills that are not substantive in nature. These are apple pie votes or hurrah votes. And this is going to tend to confound the results because there tends to be a lot more of these bills than there do the important bills on which the governor might actually care enough to think about vetoing, and the legislature might care enough to think about developing an override coalition. So I'm going to look at varying cutoff levels, non-unanimous bills, bills in which first the cross-sectional tests are going to look at bills in which 75% of legislators vote in favor, 75% or less vote in favor of the bill. Now, these Cutoff sizes are admittedly arbitrary. Any cutoff size would be arbitrary. When we study coalition sizes, this is what a lot of people do. They pick a cutoff size. I want to tell you that I'm going to use 75%. These results are robust to set between 70 and 80% of coalition sizes. Other analysts use 60%. That's too low for our purposes because in 2/3 override, we would expect at least 67%. So 75% seems like a nice compromise. And again, I want to emphasize the results work for things between 70 and 80%. So the 75% cutoff is not that critical here. Okay, so here's the data. The data is first what is taken from Gerald Wright's votes within state chambers. He has one session of votes from every state chamber. It's the 1999 to 2000 session. The reason we have only one year is because it's actually incredibly difficult to get roll call votes for state chambers. They don't do a very good job of keeping track of these votes. As part of this project, my co-authors and I went through and coded up these votes. We looked only for final passage votes, not votes on amendments, not procedural votes, only final passage votes on bills where the veto would be an important component. So each vote actually has a short description. We read the description, coded it as a final passage vote. There are some states, there are a handful of states we couldn't do this for, or I should say a handful of chambers we couldn't do this for because there wasn't a description of what the vote was, enough of a description to know if it was a final passage vote. We also excluded states, or I should say I also excluded states with off-year elections. New Jersey, Virginia, among others, they conduct state legislative elections in off years, which means they had an election in 1999. Can't use those states because we have different legislators. We can't compare coalition sizes across the two. And as I suggested, the winning coalition size is the cutoff I'm going to use is 0.75, 75% of legislators or fewer vote in favor of the bill to screen out unimportant, non-substantive legislation. Here are the regression results. So I want to talk briefly about what's going on here. The unit of analysis are votes across these different chambers. We have dummy variables for in the first model, whether it was a supermajority. The 1/2 + 1 is the excluded category. In the second model, under the divided government heading, you see there, I have individual dummy variables for the 3/5 and 2/3 override requirement. The dependent variable is the size of the legislative coalition. It's a percentage, so we can interpret these directly. So as we see, supermajorities compared to 1/2 increases coalition sizes by about 2%, exactly as expected. And we see that 3/5 and 2/3 also both increase coalition sizes as expected. The 3/5 requirement by about 1.7%, the 2/3 requirement by about 2.1%. In other words, in 2/3 states, coalition sizes on final passage bills are 2.1% larger than they are in majority size states, or states, I should say, with a majority override requirement. 2.1% is a fairly significant substantive effect. The average legislative chamber has about 110 to 120 members, so we're talking another 2 to 3 to 4 people who are voting in favor of a bill. And as I'm going to demonstrate or talk about a little bit later, these can be critical votes in certain situations. We also see things like legislative professionalism matter, and that has a pretty strong effect, as does majority party size, obviously. I should say, I have other models I use to specify. Different models use different final passage cutoffs, 0.7 to 0.8. Multi-level model to deal with the fact that votes are nested within states. Other specifications, other control variables, these results hold up and they're pretty robust. The other thing I want to say briefly is that the results in support of the theory only exist in divided government. During periods of unified government, there is no significant difference between 3/5 and 2/3 overrides as compared to a majority override. And that's strong support for the theory because, again, the formal model demonstrated that the executive must be relatively far away from the legislature, from the chamber median. Okay. Now, cross-sectional results are nice, and they provide those results provide pretty strong evidence. But of course, there are limits on the inferences we can make from cross-sectional results. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you some results from North Carolina. As I mentioned, North Carolina adopted the veto in 1997. 1997 was the first year it was available to the governor. So we can actually treat North Carolina as kind of a natural experiment. Lucky for me, North Carolina had divided government during this period. In fact, the governor was the same, Jim Hunt. He was a Democrat. He was reelected in 1996. The House was controlled by Republicans. The Senate was controlled by Democrats. And you can see the Republicans lost a few seats between 1996 and 1997. The Democrats lost a few seats in the Senate. Really, the only substantive thing that changes here is that the veto is available in the 1997 term. So really, if we're treating this as a true natural experiment, one of the things that I can do is I can simply compare coalition sizes in North Carolina before and after the introduction of the veto. On the left, I have some histograms. On the right, I actually have tables that demonstrate these differences. Again, the sample of all votes is the cutoff used, or I should say the sample of votes is the cutoff used for those votes, so including all votes, non-unanimous votes, and votes that receive 0.95. I can't use the 0.75 coalition size here. We just don't have enough votes. The way we collected this data actually is we got vote totals from the state of North Carolina in book form or microfiche form and actually read through them and coded up the votes. Okay, you'll notice that in the House, the difference between 95 and 96, regardless of the cutoff, is always statistically significant at the 0.05 level. In the Senate, the coalitions, all votes or non-unanimous votes, the difference between pre-veto and post-veto is also statistically significant, the 0.05 level. When we get down to votes that are 0.95 or less, it's a 0.1 difference. This is probably simply because there's not very many votes. We're dealing with an N of 75 post-veto. So these North Carolina results combined with the cross-sectional data is pretty strong evidence that the veto override requirement has an effect on the legislature. It has an effect on how the legislature puts together a coalition. And as I suggested, larger coalitions suggest more moderate policy, and they suggest policy that's closer to the governor if the governor is opposed to the status quo, but only when the governor and the legislature are far away from each other. Okay. We usually conceive of the veto as a negative power, that is, the ability for the governor to stop something. And in fact, again, we come back to Hamilton in Federalist 73. He talks about the negative, he talks about the power of the veto to return bills, preventing their becoming law. But can we think about the veto as a positive power, as a bargaining tool for the governor? And this is important because this has implications for how much governors get when they bargain with legislatures, how much legislatures get, and it has implications not only for policy outcomes, but for attributing responsibility for policy outcomes, for the popularity of the legislature versus the executive. So the question asked here is, do veto override requirements produce different outcomes? Do they allow the governor to actually engage positively in a positive action rather than just a negative one? And if so, under what conditions? The simple claim I'm going to make is that the veto override requirement structures legislative executive bargaining, and as executives become more successful, as the veto override requirement increases, executives are going to be more successful in achieving their policy, their preferred policy. I'm going to use the budget process to demonstrate that. The budget process is a particularly good way to go about it for one specific reason. In the budget process, we have a statement of the governor's preferred policy, and that is the governor's proposed budget, and we have a measure of the actual enacted policy, and that is, or the policy that we actually get, and that's the policy that's enacted by the legislature into law and signed by the governor. That is, we can measure the difference between the governor's preferred policy and the final outcome. And we can do that empirically because we have data on what the governor asked for and what the legislature passed. So budgetary data is a really good way of measuring gubernatorial preferences versus what actually happens. Again, there have been attempts in other countries to measure executive preferences, and in the United States. In Latin America, there's quite a bit of literature on presidential batting averages, comparative literature, I should say. That is when the president takes a stand on something, how often is that bill successfully passed into law? There is an endogeneity problem here and a selection problem because, of course, we would suspect that presidents are more likely to take stands on things based on their perceived likelihood of them becoming law. Using budgetary data avoids all these problems. Okay, so simply the budgetary process in the states, as in the federal government, it works like this. The governor proposes a budget, the legislature is able to modify that budget, though they tend to work off the governors. They pass the budget, the governor then has the option of signing or vetoing, and of course the legislature can override a veto if possible. I want to formally return to these examples again to demonstrate why the governor should be more successful in cases where the veto override requirement is higher. If we return to the 50% plus one veto override requirement, again, the governor can propose whatever they want. The chamber median, however, can pass whatever they want. That is, budgetary policy will be proposed at E. The budget that's eventually passed will be at the chamber meeting. Why? Because that's the veto override pivot. They don't need anybody else. They'll simply pass that policy. You'll notice there's a large distance between those 2 points. As we increase the veto override to 2/3, the executive here can propose policy at E or close to E, and the veto override pivot, if the legislature passes something that is far away from the executive and the executive vetoes it, the veto override pivot must be satisfied. That is, they must prefer that policy. Because they're so close to the governor, that new policy must also be close to the governor, even if they override the veto. So we're going to end up with a policy very close to the veto override's preference, and we're going to get policy that's also, as a result, much closer to the executive's preference. This suggests that budgetary outcomes in states with higher veto override requirements are going to produce budgets that are much closer to what the governor originally asked for. And of course, 3/5 is going to be somewhere in the middle. Okay, this budgetary data is time series cross-sectional budgetary data. I was actually able to collect proposed gubernatorial proposals and enacted budgets from the source, the Fiscal Survey of the States, between '87 and 2011. One of the other things that I need to do is I need to account for some state-specific rules and some state-specific context. There are some quirks in state budgeting procedures. A number of states actually require a supermajority to pass the budget. That's going to confound the results. I'm alternatively going to exclude those states and include them from the models to do robustness checks, see if that changes anything. I will tell you it doesn't really. Well, it doesn't mostly. I'll talk about the changes. One of the other things I need to account for is this idea that budgets are fundamentally different. They do not exist in an ideological space. They exist in a distributive space. This model is proposed by Kiewit and McCubbins. The important thing about this is that they suggest the governor's veto will only become important when the governor prefers less spending than the legislature. Why? Because if the governor prefers more, the legislature will simply enact their preference and the governor will take it. The legislature prefers, if the governor prefers less, if the governor prefers less, then the legislature will go too far, the governor can veto it. If the governor prefers more, the legislature can't go far enough, so there will never be a veto. That's the basic idea. I'm simply going to run models that subset the data only for those states in which the governor actually proposed less than was eventually enacted. The results are almost exactly the same. But I think this is an important thing to account for because this is a prominent explanation of budgetary outcomes. Again, the independent variable is going to be the override threshold. The dependent variable now is going to be the per capita absolute difference between what the governor proposes and what the enacted budget is. This is descriptive data on what the proposed and enacted budgets are. As you can see, they track pretty closely. Sometimes governors propose more. Generally, the legislature enacts more, though not always. Sometimes they're relatively close to each other. You can also see the results of the recession starting in 2009. This is per capita data, by the way. Okay, and here are the results. So the dependent variable again here is the difference between the governor's proposed budget and the enacted budget. A negative coefficient indicates that the enacted budget was closer because of that variable to the proposed budget. And you can see that the two, we're again comparing 2/3 and 3/5 to the excluded category, which is a majority override requirement. And you can see that the 2/3 requirement does in fact produce budgets closer to what the governor asked for. The units here are budgets by state year. Models 1 and 2 are all budgets, and Model 1, these are this excludes states that have supermajority budget rules. These are states like Indiana, Rhode Island, Arkansas that have both a 3/5 override requirement and a budget has to be passed by 2/3 or 3/5. Model 2 includes those states. They're simply dummied out again as 2/3 or 3/5. Models 3 and 4 are the same thing, but these are subsampled states where the proposed budget is less than the enacted. You'll see the results are highly consistent across all 4 models. And notice that these are some of the only consistent results here. To give you an idea of the substantive effect, remember we're dealing in per capita budgets. The effects are about $20 to $33 per capita, depending on the model specification you use. That's how much closer the governor gets to their proposed budget. So let's compare Alabama and Louisiana. Alabama has a majority override requirement. Alabama and Louisiana have about the same population. Louisiana has a 2/3 majority override requirement. If we take that substantive effect in Alabama, that means Robert Bentley, the governor of Alabama, is between $96 and $158 million less successful than Bobby Jindal. When they propose their budget, the legislature changes it by about that much. That is a large substantive effect. And aside from legislative professionalism, that is the largest substantive effect in the model. And of course, legislative professionalism, the thing that's deemed most important in state politics. But I'm demonstrating here that the veto override requirement also has a very important effect on budgetary outcomes. And this is, I would argue, a positive effect. This is not a negative reaction. This is a power the governor is able to use. He's able to take advantage of that high override requirement to get something that's closer to his or her ideal point. Now, you'll notice in those models, by the way, that the 3/5 dummy was negative, but it was not statistically significant in any of the models. I think this is an empirical problem, not a theoretical one. As I suggested, a number of 3/5 states also have supermajority override requirements, 2/3. So we're losing some of the effects. We don't have that many 3/5 states to start with. Further, a couple of them are excluded because they have strange rules. Maryland is a 3/5 state. It is excluded from the models because in Maryland, the governor is not allowed to veto the budget. Okay. To summarize the results, do states with higher veto override thresholds have larger winning coalitions? Yes, they do, which means policy is more moderate only when the executive and the legislature are far away from each other. What about a positive power for the governor? Does the veto override requirement empower the executive? The answer is yes, when the override is set sufficiently high. So it's a qualified yes. I don't have evidence for 3/5, but there's very strong evidence for 2/3. However, as I suggested, this is an empirical problem, I think, rather than a theoretical one. Okay, let's talk about substantive implications. Do veto override requirements matter? Yes, they do. Let's just ask these 3 governors. The governor on the left is the governor of Missouri, Jay Nixon. In 2013, he vetoed. He's facing a unified Republican legislature. He's a Democrat. The legislature actually has a 2/3 majority in both chambers. They can override vetoes if they need to. In 2013, they passed a number of anti-tax bills and some gun bills, some pro-gun bills, not believing that Jay Nixon would veto the bills. He did. They made these bills so conservative that even a number of Republicans balked. They didn't vote for the bills. As a result, they could not override his veto. They came back in 2014, they learned their lesson, they moderated these bills ever so slightly, and Nixon again vetoed them. One of the notable bills he vetoed was a bill allowing teachers to carry concealed guns in the classroom. He vetoed that bill, but because the Republicans made that bill sufficiently moderate to attract support from 2/3 of their membership, of the chamber, I should say, Jay Nixon's bill was overridden by the 2/3 majority of Republicans. The middle pane is Mike Beebe. He's the governor of Arkansas. Arkansas is a state with a majority override requirement. He again faces a Republican legislature. The legislature passed last year what many people have called the strictest voter ID requirements in the country. Mike Beebe vetoed these bills, this voter ID bill. His veto was overridden by a simple majority because that's the rule in Arkansas. The majority can override a veto. Okay. Finally, my favorite story on the right, that's Beverly Perdue. She's the former governor of North Carolina. She was a rising star in the Democratic Party. She took office at a bad time, unfortunately. She served only one term. She faced a unified Republican legislature. Beverly Perdue vetoed both the 2011 and 2012 budgets passed by the state legislature. Both of those, remember North Carolina is a 3/5 override state. Both of those 2011 and 2012 budget vetoes were overridden by one vote. Beverly Perdue eventually became known as the veto governor in North Carolina because she vetoed so many bills. A number of them were overridden by one vote in both chambers. What can we conclude for this? Well, first of all, we've measured legislative coalitions, but legislative coalitions are really a proxy for policy outcomes. The more extreme the policy outcome, the smaller the coalition, the farther away from the status quo is what I mean by that. And it turns out that lower veto override coalitions promote more extreme policy outcomes. This also has implications for how much stuff gets done. Though lower override coalitions promote more extreme policy outcomes, they also promote more policy action. As we demonstrated, or as we saw in the formal model, the gridlock interval expands when you have higher override requirements. This has implications for policy stability and the rate of policy change within the state. The other important conclusion is that vetoes and the override requirement is an important component of bargaining, and it's an important component at least of budgetary bargaining. This has implications for gubernatorial popularity, implications for legislative agendas, the rate and scope of policy change. If we think about the role of executives in the American system as compared to legislatures, as I suggested, the framers were worried about giving each too much power. We can think about the federal 2/3 override requirement as something that tends to give the presidents more power. Now, this has implications today because there's a general sense in the American system over the last 50 to 80 years that presidents have seized a lot more power. And the framers might have been uncomfortable with our president-centric system nowadays. One of the things, though this hasn't changed, one of the institutional things that continues to give the president more power is the 2/3 override requirement. We can also think about this in the context of Latin America. Latin America has a history. There's a tendency for Latin American countries to have imperialistic presidents. Again, one of the things that would give presidents in these systems is an institutional rule of a 2/3 veto override. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.